Hey everybody, and welcome to another edition here of these AMSCO textbook readings. Today we're going to be looking at section 6.1, Rationales for Imperialism. So let's go ahead and get started. Rudyard Kipling was an English writer who spent his youth in British colonial India. The speaker in his poem urged the whites of Western countries to establish colonies for the good of the inferior people of the world. Whether Kipling actually supported this idea is not clear, but his poem was used to justify it. Proponents justified European colonization using a variety of explanations, from a belief in nationalism, a desire for economic wealth, a sense of religious duty, and a belief they were biologically superior. These various motives for establishing overseas empires, a policy called imperialism, would lead to conflicts in Asia and a scramble to colonize Africa. Nationalist motives for imperialism. In Western Europe, revolutions, the rise of nationalism, and the creation of nation-states characterized much of the 1800s. With a strong sense of identity and loyalty to a state, many world powers boldly asserted authority over other territories. Building an empire in Asia or Africa was one way for a country to assert its national identity in the global arena. Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands would long possess overseas colonies. European nationalism. After losing its American colonies, Britain looked for new lands to open to settlement. In 1788, the first British settlers arrived in the colony of New South Wales on the east coast of the island continent of New Holland, today's Australia. Britain was also expanding its influence in South Asia, gradually taking control of India from the East India Company. By 1857, Britain controlled the entire Indian subcontinent. Ceylon, Burma, and the Malay states, and parts of Borneo in the Southeast Asia were also under British control. France compensated for its humiliating defeat by Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War by expanding its overseas territories. It had already occupied Algeria and northern Africa, New Caledonia and other islands in the South Pacific, Senegal and Western Africa, and Indochina in Southeast Asia. Italy and Germany were newly unified states in the late 19th century. Each wanted colonies not only for economic and strategic reasons, but also for prestige. However, neither began acquiring an empire until the mid-1880s. While Spain led the quest for colonies in the first wave of imperialism during the 16th and 17th centuries, its power was greatly diminished by the 19th century. It did not play a dominant role in this second wave of imperialism. Japan and East Asia. Japan asserted its nationalist pride through incursions into Korea. This irritated China, a country that had exerted a strong presence in Korea for centuries. The conflict grew into the Sino-Japanese War. Japan's victory gave it control of Korea. Japan also seized Taiwan, which was known as Formosa, from the time of Portuguese colonization in the 16th century until the end of World War II. Cultural and religious motives for imperialism. The Kipling quotation that opens this topic epitomized the condescending attitude shared by imperialism's proponents. Referring to colonized peoples as children reflected how colonizers saw themselves as benevolent protectors on a civilizing mission rather than invaders. Radical ideologies and the misuse of science. The attitude of whites toward others were a form of racism. Colonial powers generally believed that they were inherently superior to those they subjugated. Pseudoscientists, people who present theories as science that are actually incompatible with the scientific method, strengthen these attitudes. They claim to have proof of the intellectual and physical inferiority of non-white races. Phrenologists, people who studied skull sizes and shapes, believe that a smaller skull size proved the mental feebleness of Africans, indigenous Americans, and Asians. These ideas have been proven false. Legitimate science was also subverted to support imperialism. British scientist Charles Darwin's 19th century theory of evolution by natural selection stated that over millions of years, biological competition had weeded out the weaker species in nature, and that the fittest species were the ones that survived. Some thinkers adapted Darwin's theory of biological evolution to society, creating the theory known as social Darwinism. While Darwin himself was not a social Darwinist, advocates used the survival of the fittest theory to argue that the spread of European and U.S. power proved the biological superiority of whites. Writers and politicians then used social Darwinism to justify further imperialism by powerful countries. Cultural ideologies. Based on technological superiority over indigenous societies, colonial powers felt justified in superimposing aspects of their own cultures on their colonies. For administrative purposes, many colonies combined into a single colony peoples from several cultures who often spoke different languages and had different customs. Colonizers introduced their own language, which helped to unify these often diverse colonies. They also introduced their political, educational, and religious institutions and exerted other cultural influences on architecture and recreational activities. Expressing the belief of many, Congregationalist minister Josiah Strong wrote in 1885, "Is there room for reasonable doubt that the Anglo-Saxon race is destined to dispossess many weaker races, assimilate others, and mold the remainder until, in a very true and important sense, it has Anglo-Saxonized mankind?" Religious motives. Missionaries were among the most tireless civilizing influences. Like the Spanish and Portuguese Catholic missionaries who combined conquest and evangelism during the Age of Discovery, British Protestant missionaries of the 18th and 19th centuries also participated in colonization. Critics charge that missionaries supported imperialism by persuading people to give up their traditional beliefs, such as ancestor veneration, and adopt the faith of most Europeans, Christianity. This change in religion could pave the way for others who were more focused on economic gain. In response, missionaries pointed out that they commonly combined religious and humanitarian efforts. Missionaries often set up schools for instruction in religion that also taught secular subjects, which prepared students to become teachers, lawyers, and other professionals. Many missionaries provided improved medicines and medical care. Some missionaries, most famously David Livingstone from Scotland, worked in sub-Saharan Africa to end the illegal slave trade. Economic motivations for imperialism. Some people believe the ideological motivations were more accurately justifications for pursuing economic motives. Seeking ways to maximize profits, companies chartered by the British, French, and Dutch governments signed commercial treaties with local rulers in India, East Africa, and the East Indies. These treaties gave the Europeans the right to establish trading posts and forts to protect their interests. Originally, these companies formed primarily for the spice trade. Many companies had quasi-governmental powers, raising armies and conquering territory to form colonies. As the Industrial Revolution transformed European economies, the desire for the sources for raw materials and markets for manufactured goods provided by colonies enticed imperial powers to increase their expansion. Imperial powers often competed with one another over the best potential resources, markets, and trade on demands for low-wage labor. Access to markets and control of natural resources increased. East India Company. The English monarch granted the East India Company a royal charter in 1600, giving it a monopoly on England's trade with India. After driving the Portuguese out of India, the company traded primarily in cotton and silk, indigo, and spices. Eventually, the EIC expanded its activities from the Persian Gulf to East Asia. By the beginning of the 18th century, it had become the major agent of British imperialism in India, and after 1834, it became the British government's managing agency in India. Starting in 1620, the EIC engaged in the slave trade, and during the 19th century, it illegally exported opium to China in exchange for tea. The East India Company is often referred to as the English East India Company, or, after 1707, the British East India Company, to distinguish it from the Dutch East India Company. Dutch East India Company. In 1602, the Dutch government gave the Dutch East India Company a monopoly on trade between the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa and the Straits of Magellan at the southern tip of South America. The VOC concentrated on the islands around Java, replacing the Portuguese who had controlled the region. Corruption and debt led the government to take control of the company's possessions in 1799, creating the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia. The new imperialism. After the Industrial Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was the leading economic power throughout the first half of the 19th century and already had a sizable colonial empire. Its colonies provided raw materials such as cotton, wool, jute, vegetable oils, and rubber for its factories, as well as foodstuffs such as wheat, tea, coffee, cocoa, meat, and butter for its growing cities. Its colonies, especially settler colonies such as Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, also provided markets for British manufactured goods. As the Second Industrial Revolution progressed, other nations began to challenge Britain's economic lead. They looked to Asia, Africa, and the Pacific to expand their markets, provide raw materials for their factories, and food for their growing urban populations.